Hi, my name is John, and this is the video lecture for History Unit 3 on the rise of English. If we combine first and second language speakers, English is by far the most spoken language in the world, with about 1.2 billion speakers. Its dominance as a global language of commerce, politics, and education is so universal, so ubiquitous, and so decentralized that this year, even as the United Kingdom, the original home country of the English language, is leaving the European Union, English will remain the primary official working language of the EU. This, despite the fact that it is not the first language of any major population in any of the remaining EU countries. English is also one of the most common languages around the world of shift. Hundreds of endangered languages are losing speakers directly to English. But English isn't a particularly special language, at least as a language. It's not even really a very easy one to learn. If you've ever tried to learn it, you know that. There's some weird grammar. There's way too many vowels. It's a lot more than the 5 that we say there is. And the spelling system is so difficult that young children can actually win large sums of money if they do it correctly in front of an audience. So how then exactly did this kind of strange language end up becoming the major world language that it is today? That's the question that we're going to address in this lecture, based primarily on the history of the English language as described in Nick Osler's Empires of the Word. His chapter has a kind of poetic title that I like, Microcosm or Distorting Mirror, a title that indicates that the rise and history of English may tell us about the process of language development and growth in general. That's the microcosm part. But also that as speakers of English, we might have kind of a warped sense of language and the nature of relationships of languages to one another because of the very fact that we speak the dominant world language. So let's get right into the history. So before we get into the details of the history, let's make sure we are on the same page in terms of our terminology, especially since here in the US we have a tendency to kind of use English and British interchangeably. Here on the screen we have the British Isles, the largest island of which is Great Britain. And on Great Britain there are 3 separate nations, England, Wales, and Scotland. They are independent nations, sort of historically, and now they are all kind of part of one large United Kingdom along with Northern Ireland. But England is part of Britain. And English people are kind of a subset of British people. But historically, the center of power in the British Empire or in British government has pretty much always been in England. So that's kind of why we use the two interchangeably sometimes. Anyway, the early foundations of the English language were laid in the 5th century when Germanic-speaking tribes from northern Denmark, or what is now northern Denmark, crossed over the North Sea, as you can see in this map, and began setting up colonies on the island of Great Britain. Now, they were not the first people there, and when they came, they fought with Celtic-speaking tribes that were already living on the island of Great Britain. And eventually, through a lot of small wars, they ended up setting up small kingdoms across what is now England and creating the earliest version of an identifiable English identity. People in these first English kingdoms spoke what we today call Old English, which is a language that is very, very different from any kind of English that we know. If you ever had to read Shakespeare in high school, that is not Old English. That is actually just early modern English. Old English is another Germanic language that it has some words that you might recognize, but if you tried to read it or ever heard it spoken, you wouldn't really recognize hardly anything. You wouldn't understand it. So the Old English-speaking population grew over a few hundred years after initially, migrating over from Northern Europe. But Celtic languages were still also spoken by a sizable population as well, right? So this all changed completely in the year 1066, which is when a group of people called the Normans, who were basically ex-Vikings who had been living in France for a couple hundred years, invaded England and successfully took over the country. And those people spoke what we're going to call Norman French, which is sort of similar to the French that you think of, but a little bit different. When they invaded and successfully took over the countryside, they invaded with a relatively small force. And in the first generation of Norman control of England, maybe 1 in every 100 people spoke this Norman French. But those people who spoke Norman French were the winners, and they were the people in charge, right? Norman French became the language of government and prestige, and within about 100 years after the Normans got there, pretty much all written documents in the country were written in Norman French, not English. That doesn't mean, however, that people stopped speaking English. It just means that it kind of was no longer important enough that people felt like writing anything down in it. This was a very divided society where you had upper-class lords and royalty speaking primarily Norman French, and everyone else kind of below them, servants, farmers, merchants, they were speaking English. Now, Norman French had a big influence on English, right? There were some people who were bilingual, people spoke back and forth, and there were a lot of like loan words from Norman French into English, and some important changes in grammar that over time led to a move from that Old English to what we now call Middle English, something that is still pretty much impossible for a modern English speaker to understand if you try and read it. If you ever had to read the Canterbury Tales in middle school or high school by Geoffrey Chaucer, that was originally written in Middle English. And you might recognize a few more words. It's a little bit closer, but it's still very, very different. So this linguistic arrangement, where you had an upper crust nobility speaking French and all the workers and servicemen below them speaking English, kind of got exported all over Britain outside of England, and around the British Isles when the Norman kings went around conquering land in what is now Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. All of these places were almost entirely Celtic speaking before these Norman kings went around taking control. But as Norman control spread, the Norman kings began to see speaking those indigenous Celtic languages, the languages that people had been speaking previously, as kind of a sign of disloyalty to the new Norman rulers. But because Norman French was seen as being kind of like reserved for the upper class, for people in positions of power, the rulers actually, in order to stop people from speaking these Celtic languages, created laws to try and force people to speak English, right? So the Norman kings eventually lost ties with their connections in France and began to see themselves more and more as really just English. The Black Plague struck England in 1348, and there was a massive loss of population, which led to economic and social upheavals that over time eventually ended up giving commoners more political power and social mobility. So English kind of rose in prominence as Norman French was kind of fading away. And by the end of the 14th century, English was the politically dominant language of all of England and really most of the British Isles as well. So then England made its initial spread across the British Isles largely as a kind of second-tier language, very different than its current status as a language of prestige and commerce and education. So the move from being a dominant language of a small insular nation like England to becoming a major world language for English began early in the age of European exploration and colonization. In the 16th century, as Portuguese and Spanish empires were beginning to grow in places like Mexico, Central America, parts of South America, and the French were up in what is now Canada exploring the St. Lawrence River, the English were actually making their initial expansion into international waters, primarily through piracy, capturing and robbing Spanish and Portuguese ships, many of which were carrying large quantities of gold and silver that were being mined in the New World. The English actually started establishing colonies in the New World originally as bases for this state-supported piracy, but they quickly realized that planting cash crops in these places, like planting tobacco in Virginia or sugarcane in the Caribbean, was actually going to make them a lot more money than the piracy was. The need for labor to farm these cash crops was what began the initial major migration of two groups of people that would end up forming the backbone of the English-speaking population in North America. One was indentured workers, most of which came from Britain, and two, the forced migration of enslaved people from West Africa. The former, those indentured workers, spoke English. They mostly came from Britain, and once they got to the New World, they would continue speaking English. The latter group, enslaved people from West Africa, they, of course, did not speak English in Africa, but once they came to the New World, they would either be forced to speak English or would end up speaking one of the many English-based Creole languages that developed among enslaved populations. The growth of the English language in the New World then was basically supported by revenues from sugar and tobacco, and later on cotton and indigo. The Caribbean colonies that the British took from the Spanish, like Jamaica or Barbados, they were mostly inhabited by the time the British got there and brought slaves, since the Spanish before them had decimated the indigenous Arawak and Carib populations through disease and violence. This really was not the case, however, on the North American mainland, where there were thousands of different indigenous groups in various political arrangements, speaking hundreds of different languages. The population of Native Americans at the time of European colonization, the beginning of European colonization, is something that's debated, but it certainly was many millions of people. Unlike the Spanish in Mexico or Peru, whose attitude to the indigenous people was that they wanted to convert them to Catholicism and use them as labor in their mining operations. The early English settlers on the east coast of North America really kind of only wanted one thing: land. And what that meant was that their attitude to indigenous people was to try to coexist peacefully with them as long as possible until it was necessary to expand and take more land for their growing communities and growing cash crop operations. So there was minimal cohabitation, actually living together. There was a lot of living next to each other, but not a lot of living together. And very little intermarriage between the indigenous populations and English settlers. In New England and coastal Virginia, which were the main English colonies, all of the indigenous people there were speaking various languages in the Algonquian language family. But there was hardly any English people that ended up speaking any of these Algonquian languages. There's very little bilingualism. There's very little use of indigenous languages by English settlers. And that's really quite different from the behaviors of other New World European colonizers in the same period. For the French in Canada and the Spanish in Mexico, it was mostly men who were coming over to work in colonial enterprises, and they would very often marry or at least have children with indigenous wives. So cultural and linguistic interchange was actually very common. So as a result, in, for example, Mexico, indigenous languages like Nahuatl, which was the language of the Aztec Empire, and some Mayan languages actually ended up becoming important tools of trade and governance in these Spanish colonies. Even still today, in many Latin American countries, the largest portion of the population identify as mestizo, meaning they have mixed European and indigenous heritage. The English, however, generally brought their own families when they came, meaning that the cultural mixing that happened in other parts of the New World didn't really happen in colonial America. Instead, the first 100 years of English colonization was kind of marked by cycles of relative stability for a little bit in terms of relations with indigenous neighbors, followed by local wars that would last for a few years until the English were able to expand and take over the territory that they wanted. In the same time period, it wasn't just the English fighting with indigenous people. The major colonial powers, the English, the French, Spanish, and Dutch, were all fighting numerous wars for control over North American colonies throughout the 1700s. But the most important of these wars was the War for American Independence. In the Declaration of Independence that the American colonists wrote to the English King William III, one of the most crucial grievances that the colonists used to justify their secession from the British Crown was not, as we often remember, talk about things like taxes on sugar or taxes on tea, but instead, one of the big kind of sticking points was that the English government had placed a lot of restrictions on colonial expansion into indigenous territory. The English had agreements with large indigenous groups in what is now like the Midwest to not allow English colonists to expand west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so the War for Independence was fought, at least in part, to make further westward expansion through displacement of indigenous peoples possible. Once the American Revolution succeeded, that meant there was now an autonomous local source of expansion for English and for English colonies on the North American continent. The federal system that was established by the U.S. government was actually very well suited for this kind of imperial expansion, since newly acquired territories went through a formal process of being first official territories and then becoming a state, right? In 1783, which was less than 2 centuries after the first English colony at Roanoke, English was the official language of every settlement on the east of North America, but 3/4 of what is now the continental U.S. was still under the nominal, right, on paper control of foreign powers like France, Spain, or Britain. And in reality, of course, most of the de facto control was indigenous. But by 1853, which is only about 2 generations later, right? Think about, your parents' lifetime and your grandparents' lifetime. The USA went from having control about a quarter of the continent to control of all of what is now the continental United States, right? Sea to shining sea, Atlantic to Pacific. And by 1890, the English-speaking colonists had set up cities and farms in basically every part of the continental U.S. where there are people today. Now, the impact on indigenous communities and indigenous languages was, of course, immense. Language shift from indigenous languages to English occurred in the U.S. both as kind of a byproduct of massive socioeconomic shifts that were brought on by colonization, but it also happened through direct means, like the violent suppression of indigenous languages in these assimilationist boarding schools that many indigenous children were forced to attend. But the growth of the growth of the English-speaking population in the U.S. was not based on getting other people to speak English, at least not in this period, right? There was some of that, but rather the growth of English in the United States is the story of a massive population boom that was fueled by this colonial expansion into new territory, right? You take over new territory, people move in with their families, and all of this new land that you can farm and make money off of just allowed for a massive population boom. Lots of big families, lots of kids, and that means lots of new English speakers, right? A similar story and pattern of growth can be seen in other English settler colonial societies like Canada or Australia. And even though in the 20th and 21st century, most of the immigrants to the U.S. are not primarily English speakers, that massive boom in the 19th century in the English-speaking population meant that English has kind of always been the de facto language of government, economic, and educational interaction, even though in the U.S., and this surprises a lot of people still, English is not the official language. It's just that it's been so dominant for so much of our history that people never really deemed it necessary to make it official. It was kind of obvious that was what was going to happen. So the story of settler growth on newly conquered lands is really only half of the story of the rise of English. So a population boom alone does not produce a globally dominant world language like English. Look at a language like Japanese, which, depending on how you count, is something like the 10th or 11th most spoken language in the world, which out of 7,000 some languages is, you're doing a good job. But that's because the country of Japan, where Japanese is spoken by an overwhelming majority of the population, went through a huge population boom in the 20th century, right? There's a lot of Japanese speakers, mostly because there's a lot of ethnic Japanese people. Japanese is, of course, an influential language around the world, and there are a lot of non-Japanese people who learn to speak it as a second language, but it's used primarily in Japan or in relation to Japan, right? There's no two countries outside of Japan that use Japanese as a common means of communication, the same way that Japanese speakers might use English when doing business with, just for example, Italian speakers. So the growth of English to populations with no direct ethnic or political ties to England began in the second phase of the British Empire, and it's best summed up by British imperial control of India. So after the British lost their kind of prized colonial possession in the War for American Independence at the end of the 18th century, they had kind of a never-again attitude to settler colonialism. The American settler colonial pattern of bringing families to newly conquered lands was a lot less appealing to the British after the American Revolution, since those settlers ended up developing unique cultural and political identities and chose to split off, which meant a breaking off of the revenue stream that they provided to the English crown. When colonial expansion then kind of shifted in the 18th and 19th centuries to Asia, Osler says India and other Asian colonies were always, quote, places for careers, not lives. They were places for postings, not family homes, right? The attitude was, this is all business from here on out. So the English East India Company acquired its first bases in India in the middle of the 17th century, and British colonization of India until the year 1858 was completely run by the East India Company, right? So this corporation was basically the government in British-controlled India. Now, at the time when they first started operating there, most of the trade that they did for things like spices or tea or lumber, it was conducted with the help of translators in languages other than English. They got translators in languages of other previous major imperial powers in the region, primarily in Persian and Portuguese. And the initial growth of English in India was actually led by not these people in the East India Company, but by Protestant missionaries, right? Christian missionaries. The East India Company didn't really like them coming into India and trying to convert the Hindus and Muslims, since it mostly just kind of annoyed people, and that was bad for business. But the missionaries began to become more and more important when they began founding English language schools, which were attended by both children of company employees, East India Company employees, and also local servants. As English business grew in India in the early 19th century, upper-class Indians actually began to view these English language schools as a means to build business ties and set their children up for future economic success in an economy that was increasingly dominated by the British. Many of the teachers in these English schools at the beginning were kind of, for lack of a better word, bums. They were just people that were in it for the money. It was easy cash, I guess. But kind of over time, as these English schools gained more clout, you had more members of the kind of upstanding British citizenry latching on to this idea that we now refer to as the white man's burden, which is the racialized and racist idea that it was the responsibility of white Britons to bring the uncivilized world, which basically means the non-white world, up to the moral and intellectual level of the British. So getting involved with English language education in India became this thing that the British people largely took as a moral goal, right? That they needed to teach these people English to raise their moral and intellectual standards. English language education became a major enterprise with support both by the English colonists and by upper-class Indians, many of whom helped found schools which provided instruction either in full or in part in English. In 1835, English was widespread enough that the East India Company changed the official language of its colonies from Persian, which had been the previous colonial language, to English. In 1858, the British government took direct control of India from the English East India Company, and English remained the official language and primary language of trade and education until Indian independence in 1947. So, in modern independent India, English is officially a quote, associate official language, which means the government views it as kind of a secondary language of communication, but one that is of lesser importance than the 18 official regional languages in the country. But India is a very multilingual place, as this language map shows. And any one of the regional official languages, like Hindi, which is the most spoken of the regional languages in the north, any of those languages have ethnic and regional and political affiliations that make them kind of problematic as use as a language of national communication. And that's just because any one of them kind of is going to bother some other group of people if you try and make it into a major national language. So English in many ways remains the default language of communication for a lot of people, especially the educated upper class of the country. As Osler puts it in his book, and in an ethnically and religiously diverse country like India, English has a certain appeal as a language that, if not entirely neutral, is, quote, seen as equally oppressive to everybody. It rubs everybody the wrong way, but kind of equally. In India, as elsewhere in old British colonies of Asia, English immigrants were always very few and didn't stay for very long. But the English language drew recruits through cultural and socioeconomic prestige. As higher education continues to grow in the region and English remains the primary mechanism for it, we would expect that trend that started during the British colonial period to continue, and we would expect the number of English speakers to continue to climb. So these two models of spread, what Osler calls the American sweep-aside and Indian re-education, they were propagated all over the world in the 19th and 20th centuries. Anglo farmers established settler colonial societies in temperate regions like North America, Australia, New Zealand, even South Africa, and in tropical regions where Anglo farmers probably would not much have prospered, Colonial prestige is what transmitted English to new populations, primarily to elites. And small upper-class minorities continue to speak English in places like Kenya, Nigeria, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Philippines, among numerous others. In places that were touched by British or American colonial expansion, sometimes it was a combination of these two strategies, if you will. So the history of English in Hawaii is part settler colonialism, part economic prestige. On top of the multifaceted spread of English through British and American expansion, right, just imperialism, part of the rise of English as a dominant world language is also a coincidence of historical timing. Other colonial languages have been globally dominant before, like Portuguese or French, but the rise of English has kind of happened to coincide with a few other really important global shifts that have made English a more dominant global language than probably any before it. It started with the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain. When the British first began their trading enterprises in Asia, they wanted things like foreign spices, teas, fabrics, and pottery, but they had very little of their own that anyone else actually wanted. This dynamic changed really quickly, though, when Britain became the center of the Industrial Revolution, starting in the late 18th and early 19th century. And they were producing manufactured goods that by 1860 accounted for 2/5 of the global market. So especially once the U.S. kind of caught up to Britain in terms of its own industrial output, English just became an unavoidable facet of international trade by the beginning of the 20th century. This commercial dominance that emerged because of the Industrial Revolution was amplified by constant development of new communications technologies in the 19th and 20th century, so like telephones, radios, television, and eventually the internet. Many of these major technological innovations that have occurred since the Industrial Revolution were invented by English speakers in English-speaking countries. And when they weren't, oftentimes it was English-speaking developers who made them economically viable. So, for example, it was pioneers in France, like the Lumiere brothers, that kind of developed the actual technology and framework for the motion picture. But it was the English-speaking filmmakers and studios in Hollywood that developed the motion picture into the incredibly lucrative film industry that we know today. The fact that English-speaking countries happen to be in major positions of geopolitical power during these massive changes in global communications and international business means that the spread of English nowadays is basically self-propagating, and it has been for some time. English-speaking governments don't have to push their language. In business, some 85% of international conferences use English as their official language, or at least a major official language. English language media continues to be globally dominant in a large chunk of the globe, especially on the internet, where in many countries, two native speakers of a non-English language, like German, for example, they might use English for digital communication even when they would never speak English to each other face to face. English is, in many places, the language of the internet. English language teaching is a massive international market with millions of teachers who themselves are second, not first language speakers of English. There's an old English proverb that's actually very fitting for this. Nothing succeeds like success. Within the next 50 years, second language speakers of English will certainly outnumber first language speakers, if they don't already. Many specialists agree that the global speaking population of English is undercounted. So English is, in many ways, a microcosm of language history, because we see in its history a combination of different methods for growth, all of which individually have led to the spread of other major world languages. It spread through conquest and forced shift, like how the Norman Kings forced it on Celtic speakers, or how the U.S. government forced it on American indigenous communities. It's grown through a massive population boom, like what was seen during American westward expansion. It's grown because of cultural and economic prestige, like the growth of English language schools in India. And it's grown because it is just so dominant that it kind of is a positive feedback loop. It demands that others learn it in order to succeed. And that's kind of what we see now in the 21st century, where it is the default language of global communication. So, in the end, is English's place among world languages really that unique? Maybe. Is it really the most dominant global language that there's ever been? Maybe. It's really hard to say for certain, since, it's hard to judge the present as we live through it. And as we move through the 21st century, it seems really hard to imagine that English will ever kind of fall from where it currently is at the moment in its peak position among world languages. But I'll leave you with this. In the year 1500 BC, which is 3,500 years before today, but over 1,000 years after the birth of Egyptian civilization, the Egyptian pharaohs of the New Kingdom, right, new because it was 1,000 years into Egyptian civilization, they probably felt like their Egyptian language was just as permanent and inevitable and unavoidable. But today, in the 21st century, the descendant language of the Egyptian language spoken by the pharaohs exists as only a religious language for a small ethnic minority in Egypt, and it has maybe a couple of hundred speakers. So, well, nothing lasts forever, I guess is the point. Thank you.